Good morning, everyone from Arizona. Welcome to our Christmas card virtual watercolor party. My name is Shalom, and I'm the artist behind Shalom's art. I'm so excited that you're joining me this morning to paint Christmas cards. We're going to be painting these two designs right here, these Christmas trees and this little Christmas wreath right here. Normally these watercolor parties take about an hour and a half to 2 hours, so not too long, but really fun. We're going to start with practicing the techniques that we're going to be using, and then we're going to cut and score our paper together, and then we'll actually paint the cards. And a lot of you have been asking if this video will be available later. It definitely will. I always post these virtual watercolor parties to my Facebook feed, and you'll be able to find it under my video tabs and on my feed later on. So you can re-watch it, you can share it with your friends, or if this isn't a good time for you, because I know a lot of you are from all over the place, so if this is not a good time for you, you can watch it when it is convenient for you. So yeah, we're also going to take a look at our watercolor supplies as well. Anyway, thank you again so much for watching. I'm so excited that you're here. I'm so excited that some of you are already commenting. Please feel free to ask questions anytime. I'll be doing my best to follow the comments and be watching that. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn my camera around so that you can see my desk. Okay. Okay. Just tighten that up a little bit. Okay. All right. So I always use watercolor tubes for my watercolor painting, and this is my favorite brand, American Journey. There are a lot of great brands out there though. I'll be using phthalo blue, sap green, and quinacridone red. And I usually pour those paints onto a palette or a tile or anything. Really, even just a kitchen plate will work just fine also. I'm going to be using some cold press watercolor paper, and we'll cut this and score it and all that. I am using sheets today because they have this lovely, beautiful decal edge, and I think that looks really pretty on note cards. Here's my example. You can see a decal edge is just that ripped edge right there, and it just is really kind of a homemade, fun touch. I'll also be using my pencil and an eraser, of course. Hello everyone, I'm so excited. I'm seeing all your comments. This is making me very happy. So cool. What is the closest to phthalo blue, one of you is asking? Ultramarine is a good choice. Cobalt is another really good one. Basically, it's just colors that are on the cooler side of the color palette spectrum. So this one has maybe a touch of yellow or green to it. It's really kind of a tealish blue. It's really, really pretty. But yeah, any colors you have will work just fine. I also will be using some water. I usually have a couple jars handy on my desk. And I'm going to be using a really small brush today. This is a 00 brush. Pretty much any size that has a nice point will work pretty well. Here's some other great options, a number 2 or a 1 or a 0. Pretty much anything that has a nice point to it, because we'll be doing a few details. And I usually have tissues handy as well. I use teepee, but any kind of tissue will work. In the discussion section for this event, there are some tracing templates for you if you prefer tracing as opposed to drawing freehand. And so today I'm going to demonstrate how to trace as well as drawing one of them when we get to that point. One of you is asking for some other recommendations for reds. I'm using quinacridone, but you could also use alizarin crimson, quinacridone magenta. Pretty much any red will work just fine. The only thing I'm using red for is these little berries right here, so pretty much anything will work just fine. I'm also going to be using some scissors to cut our paper today and a ruler. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and start practicing our techniques here. We're going to be using 3 techniques: a wet and wet wash, a wet and dry wash, and a bloom. So I'm going to pour my paint onto my palette first. Let me know if at any point you can't see something or you can't hear me. I have a tendency to talk a little bit on the quieter side, so yeah, just let me know and I'll do my best to talk louder or show you whatever you'd like to see. So this again is my phthalo blue. If you don't have phthalo blue, totally fine. Pretty much any blue will work. You know, they're your cards, so use what you think looks good to you. This is my sap green, and I'm going to stick that right here in my green area. And then we have the quinacridone red here. And some of these lids are a bit tight, so I'm just using my apron. One of you is asking if there will be a replay to paint along, and yes, there will. I'll be posting this video after the live stream, so you can rewatch anytime at your convenience. And I'm just going to put this quinacridone on top of my other quinacridone that I have there. All right, so there's our colors. And I will set these aside. Sometimes it's nice to have a spray bottle to wet your paints. I've noticed in my classes that I teach, some people who are used to painting with acrylic paints are surprised at how much water we use for watercolors, but they're definitely called watercolors for a reason. We use a lot of water for them. All right, so let's practice our wet and wet wash. A wet and wet wash just means that the paper is wet and the brush is also wet. So we get the paper wet by taking some of our water from our jar or cup here, and we just wet the paper. And you'll be able to tell exactly where the water is by tilting the paper back and forth. And you'll be able to see where all the shine is. And wherever the shine is where the water is. And when we put our paint on here, the paint will flow out and kind of spread wherever our water is. It'll go wherever the paper is wet. So let's pick up some paint here. I'll get some of my phthalo blue just to practice and drop that in. All right, so wet brush, wet paper. That's our wet and wet wash. Have a little heart here. And you can kind of tilt the paper back and forth to spread the pigment out as well. All right. And then the wet and dry wash is a wet brush and dry paper. And one of you was asking where you can get these templates. They're in the discussion section for the event. So if you click on the Christmas card event on my Facebook page and go into the discussion tab and scroll down through the posts, you'll be able to find these templates. They're also on my Facebook feed on, I think, my second to last post. So you'll be able to find those as well. Okay. So back to our washes here, our practice pad. A wet and dry wash is just a wet brush and dry paper. So I'll go back into my phthalo blue here. And we'll just do a nice little heart right on there and fill it in. There we go. So that is our wet and dry wash. And then a bloom is a texture with watercolor, and they're really, really fun to do. A bloom looks kind of like these little textures right here where the water just is mixing and kind of looking like a firework in there. So we'll play around with some of those. And we can make blooms by dropping water into one of our washes. So let's go ahead and make another wet and dry wash. Blooms happen when there's two different types of wetness. When there's like a damp wetness and a super wet brush. So we want our paper to be kind of damp, kind of dry, and then when it's slightly dry, we can add a really wet drop in there. And that will push some of the drier pigment away and create a really fun bloom. I'm just gonna clean my brush here so that I can get some clean, fresh water. Okay. Now I'm dipping my brush into some clean water. This paint has dried just slightly. It's still a little bit wet. And I'm going to drop that in there. And you can see it's created a little bloom texture in there. And so those are pretty unique to watercolor. One of you is having a hard time hearing me. I'll try and talk a little louder. Thanks for letting me know. So back to our bloom here, you just add some wet water to some slightly damp pigment. And then you'll have a fun bloom texture. So these are the techniques that we're going to be using in our cards. And let's go ahead and get started on cutting and scoring our cards next. So I bought a nice big sheet of Arches cold press watercolor paper. And I got a sheet because sheets of paper usually have this decal edge, which is the ripped edge on the edge of the paper. And I wanted that ripped edge on the edge of my cards like this because it adds a really personal homemade touch. When I buy pads of paper, it doesn't always have that decal edge. You can also buy pre-made cards, but I think it's fun to know how to make them. So I thought we'd make them today. I am going to be cutting my cards into 5.5 inches wide and then 8 inches long. And if you are outside of the US and you're using centimeters, that'll be about 20 inches long. 20 centimeters long and about 14 centimeters wide. So I'm just measuring right here. I'm marking my paper, 5.5 inches. inches on this side. Okay. And now I'm just going to use my scissors to cut this. All the way down. Okay, now I have enough paper right here to make 4 cards, but we're just going to make 2 today. All right, and now I'm going to measure 8 inches. 8 inches long. Right there. And 8 inches for my second card. You are more than welcome to make your cards whatever size you would like. I usually base the size of card that I'm making on the size of envelopes that I have available. Okay. And now we'll cut those cards. Okay, and now we're going to measure the center or the middle of our card where we're going to fold it. And so I'm going to measure 4 inches down to the middle on the inside of the card. So I just turned this over because this is the outside, this is where I want to paint, and I want to go into the inside of my card. And I'm measuring 4 inches. I'm just going to mark the edges on either side. Okay, and now I'm going to do something cool called scoring. And that's where I'm going to take my scissors here, take one of the blades, and mark my paper. I'm kind of cutting about halfway or so through my paper, which helps it to fold really nicely on a nice line. And now I'm folding it over my ruler, so I have a nice straight fold. And now we have our watercolor card. And this is my envelope, so this card will fit really nicely in my envelope here. Now we're going to do that same thing again on our second card here. Turn it over to the inside of the card. I'm measuring 4 inches down the middle. There we go. and fold it over our ruler here. So it's nice and straight. Well, that one is a tad crooked. That's okay. We can trim off this little edge here. There we go. So now we have our 2 cards that we're going to paint on. One of you is asking if the inside of the paper is determined by the edging. So honestly, I could paint on either side of this paper, what I'm calling the outside or what I'm calling the inside. But I determine the outside because when I get big sheets of watercolor paper, they put a watermark on their paper. And I don't know if you can see their watermark on here. You have to kind of hold it up to the light. But basically, you'll be able to see their writing on here. And if the writing is reading from left to right, then I know that this is the side that the company or the brand is calling the front side, or the side to paint on. But honestly, either side will work just fine. I've painted on both sides. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and erase the pencil marks that I have on the outside of my paper here. You can use a kneaded eraser or one of these harder ones. I'm using my kneaded eraser because they're just my favorite. I love kneaded erasers for many reasons. I was visiting my nephew and my brother and their family a few months ago, and I was painting with one of these using one of these kneaded erasers for one of my paintings, and my nephew came up and he was so excited. He was like, "Is that clay? That looks so cool." And he was just over the moon to find out it was an eraser, because they are just the coolest things. All right, so we've got our pencil marks off, and now we get to draw our designs. So I've asked some of you in the past about how many of you prefer using the tracing templates and how many prefer drawing freehand, and I found out that it's about 50-50. So normally I draw the designs freehand, but today I thought I would demonstrate how to use the tracing paper, since quite a few of you, I think, use that option. You can trace the designs against a window, or you can trace using tracing paper. And today I'm going to show you how to use the tracing paper, just in case some of you aren't familiar with how to use that. So I'm going to flip my design and put it backwards, and take a sheet of tracing paper. Got a bit of wet paint on my finger. Okay. And now I'm going to take my pencil and trace the design onto my tracing paper. And I'm tracing the design mirrored because I'm going to flip this paper onto one of my cards, and when I flip it, I want it to be the right direction. And again, you can find these tracing templates in the discussion section or on my second to last post on my Facebook feed. There's a lot of different variations that you can do with these heart-shaped wreaths. Another variation that I painted earlier was this one, which is just all hollies. So have fun with the design and make it your own. Okay, about halfway done here. I'm just going to continue tracing this design. I use really thin lead, so it keeps breaking. That's okay. If it helps you when you trace, you can tape your papers down so that they don't move. So I know some people like to do that because it can get a little annoying when the papers are just moving all over the place. Alright, and now once you have your design traced onto the tracing paper, you can turn it over onto your card and place it wherever you want it to be on your card. I'm just putting mine on the center. And then take another pencil. I usually use one with thicker lead or even just a regular pencil, and just start pressing your graphite down and rubbing the design onto your watercolor paper. And this helps to transfer the graphite that's on your tracing paper onto the watercolor paper, which is super exciting and super fun. I don't know if you can see, but underneath my tracing paper is the graphite and my design. that's just being transferred. So this method can save a lot of time if you're wanting to do a really detailed design sometimes. And this also helps to keep the graphite nice and light when you put it onto your watercolor paper, which is pretty important because I usually don't want my graphite to show up once I paint. So I'm just pressing the graphite down wherever I have the design. Okay, and now you should have your design on here, transferred on there. I'm just going to clean that section up a little bit. So yeah, if you're using tracing paper, if you prefer to use the tracing method, that can be a really helpful way. And now I'm just going to freehand draw this other design that we have. Okay, I'm going to try and check your comments, make sure I haven't missed anything. Let's see. Oh, awesome. Yeah, one of you is using carbon paper, that works great too. Graphite paper, sure. Any of these work awesome. Yes, and one of you uses a soft pencil. Yeah, I normally would use a much softer pencil, but I didn't have one on my desk today, so I just used a thicker mechanical pencil. So great, awesome. Let's go ahead and move on, and we'll just draw the second Christmas tree design. All right. So I think I'll draw this big one first. I'm also gonna just wipe my hands a bit because they have a bit of graphite on them from tracing. Tracing, I find, can be pretty messy. There we go. Okay. Let's see. Sometimes I like to just get the general shapes out, just so I can have kind of an idea of where I'm going to put everything, and that helps me have kind of basic outline. This is really just a very free-flowing sort of shape. It doesn't even have to be exact. I'm sure many of you could probably paint these trees without even doing a pencil design beforehand. But I'm just doing this for the option for those of you who do prefer drawing beforehand. Okay, there we go. I'm just kind of lightening some of my marks here and getting rid of those triangles that I drew. And we can put a few stars up here. There we go. And then I left a few little windows in here just for some interest and to break up the color. Okay, so now we have our two pencil designs here. One of you is asking if I will be posting the video later. Yes, I always post my live watercolor party videos later, so if this video is going a bit fast for you, you can rewatch it, or if this isn't a convenient time for you, you'll have that option. You'll also be able to find my previous watercolor videos. So I just started doing these live videos in I think August I did my first one. And so this has been really fun and exciting for me and quite a learning curve. I've been learning a lot about even making these live videos. Okay, so let's see. Let's start with doing the trees. And I'll bring this tree design over so that you can have that as reference. Make sure you can see both of them. And for this design, we're going to be using the phthalo blue and the sap green. So just two colors. It's pretty straightforward and simple, I think. I'm lightening a bit of my graphite, just so not much of it will show up in the finished product. Okay, and I'm going to paint from left to right because I'm right-handed, and so that way my paint over here I won't be smudging any paint. I'll just start from here and go to the right. And the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take my 00 brush that we're using. And again, if you have a larger brush, that's totally fine. I'm using this small one because it has a nice point and I can do a lot of details, especially the details for our wreath card. And we're going to do a wet and wet wash. So just as if I were coloring in a coloring book, I'm going to fill in the lines of my tree with pure water. So I'll just take my jar of water here, clean up my space a bit. I'm taking my jar, dipping my brush in, getting it all nice and full of water, and then just spreading that water out onto my tree. So just as if this water was a crayon, I'm just filling in all the lines. Some of you may be in a more humid area than I am. Arizona is really, really dry, and so my water dries really quickly, which means I have to paint very fast so that my water doesn't dry before I can get my pigment on there. But some of you, especially those of you who are maybe in the Pacific Northwest or the UK or the coast of Canada or something like that, your water might not dry as fast as mine because the air is more humid. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're painting with water. Okay, so I have water in pretty much all of my tree. I didn't paint all the way up to the edges because when I put my pigment or my paint down, I'll have time to do all those little edge details. And I'm mostly putting this wet on wet wash on there so that the colors will blend really nicely together when I put them down. So the first color I'm going to put on my wet and wet wash here is phthalo blue. And I'm getting my color wet beforehand. Some artists call this their secret sauce, where they kind of have about 75% water to maybe 25% paint. So it just moves around really nice and smoothly. Unlike acrylics, you don't want this to be really pasty. If you were decorating a cake, watercolor would be more like the glaze, and acrylics would be more like your thick buttercream frosting. So we're really just glazing here. Just a nice thin, more transparent layer of paint. And I'm going to put that in, drop my pigment right in to my water here while it's still wet. The more water you add to your pigment or your paint, the darker it will be. The more water, the lighter it will be, and the more pigment, the darker it will be. So depending on how dark you want it or how light you want it is kind of dependent on how much water you add. Now I'm going to add some of my sap green in there and let that blend in. And I want everything to stay really wet so that my colors blend well together. The water does the work of the blending most of the time. It just kind of flows together. I'm just going back and forth between the two colors. If you're in a dry climate like mine, maybe your wash is already dried and you need to keep adding plain water to your wash down here. That happens to me all the time because it just dries so quickly here. Going back to the phthalo blue, adding some of that. Now I want more blue on the right side of my tree and more green on the left side of the tree, so that when I do the other trees, the colors won't be exactly the same when they meet up. And you can blend some of the colors together on your palette so that you get that beautiful teal color. Okay, and then while your colors are still damp on your tree, you can add a few blooms on there if you would like to add that texture. So I can take some clean water, get my brush nice and wet, and drop a bloom in there. And that's just some fun texture that can look really pretty. Most of my paint is still a bit wet on there, so I will wait. In the meantime, I'm going to paint these stars up here. And I did these with mostly blue, a bit of my teal that I'd mixed. Okay, I'm going to drop a few more blooms in there, right there, and let that dry. While this one is drying, I'm going to move over to this card, and then I'll finish painting. I'll just be going back and forth between the cards while I wait for parts to dry. So here's our heart wreath card. And this one, I had mixed our sap green and our phthalo blue to make that teal color. And then these little berries are just straight up phthalo blue, and these berries are quinacridone red, and the holly leaves are sap green. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with my teal up here in the corner to draw that line, that outline of my heart. And again, the teal is just sap green and phthalo blue mixed together. So we'll just follow that line. There we go. Got a nice little outline. And we'll do the same thing with a little more sap green down here on the bottom. I start out with some of our teal, and then I add some sap green. And I want my green to be a little lighter, so I'm adding some more water, and that just gives it a bit more of a transparent look. There we go. So we have our outline, and now let's start filling in our leaves. And this is mostly just our wet and dry wash that we had practiced earlier, this middle one here, where I'm just picking up the paint and painting right on the paper. Wet brush, dry paper. So I'm mixing up some water with my sap green so that it's not super dark and thick. And now I'll just go ahead and start filling them in. As I said earlier, these techniques are very foundational for watercolor. You can use them to make pretty much any variation of these designs that you would like. You could fill the whole wreath with holly, you could stick some mistletoe in there, you could do a bow, pretty much anything that you think would look pretty or festive, and just have fun with it. I'm going to continue doing this particular style of leaves, these long ones, long pointy ones. Just filling in the design like a coloring page. Pretty straightforward. And we have one more section of these long pointy leaves right here at the top center. leaves to be darker. And so since I want them to be darker, I'm just going to add more pigment to my water here. Pigment is just the color that they use to mix these paints. So pigment would be the dry part. So I call my paints pigment and pigment paint kind of the same thing. But just so we're on the same page, you know what I'm talking about. So I'm just adding some more pigment again to my water here. And I'm going to do the same technique, just a wet and dry wash, and fill in all these holly leaves with a darker version of my sap green. I have one more up here in this corner. Okay. And now I'm just going to go ahead and set this aside and let this dry while I come back to our Christmas tree. I had put a bit too much pigment in this section, so I'm going to add a little water to it and wash that out. Watercolors can always be reactivated with water, which can be both a good thing and a bad thing. Alright, so I smoothed that out. Now I'm going to start working on my little tree here. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with our large tree, a wet and wet wash. So I'm going to fill the whole tree up with water. put some sap green on the left side and more of the teal color on the right side. That way, the green will pop out against the teal from that larger tree. I'll just fill that in. I'm going to take some of my teal that I had mixed earlier with phthalo blue and sap green and put that up here at the top. Grab some green, blend it all in. I can smudge some areas a little bit to blend them if the water hasn't blended as much as I wanted it to. Great. And you can also add some blooms if you would like to add that texture in there. Just add some drops of water in there. And I will go ahead and let this tree dry and move back to the wreath again. Now, I used a different brand of sap green when I painted this one. And this particular sap green that I used in the first one has a bit more yellow in it, if you can tell. This time I'm using my American Journey brand, but last time I used my Daniel Smith brand. So different brands will look slightly different. Yours may look a little different than mine, I don't know. But just so you know, they're all kind of a little different, and that's totally fine. So I'm going to go ahead and use my teal that I had made earlier, and I'm going to paint these little heart-shaped leaves. I actually want a little more green in my teal, so I'm going to pick some green up and mix that in. And this again, this is just the wet and dry technique that we had practiced earlier. So I'm just using wet paint on dry paper. Now I'll paint these heart-shaped leaves over in this side. Something else that you could do with these heart-shaped wreaths is you can write a word on the inside, like hope or joy or peace or Merry Christmas if you wrote it really small, or maybe even someone's name. So that's another fun customization sort of thing that you could do with these. You could also write something on the Christmas tree design, maybe on the bottom. And you can paint on your envelopes. Just have so much fun. There's so many cool things you can do. Okay. Now I'm going to mix a brown. I'm going to mix a brown for these little stems to my holly berries there. And a brown is just mixed all three of the colors together. So I will take some of my quinacridone red here. Bit of my sap green. Tiny tad of blue. More green. There, and we're starting to get a nice brown there. Okay, and now I'm going to paint my berries. So I'm going to add some water to my red, water that down. And just fill them in. I have no idea if there are actually blueberries. I know there's white berries, but I put blueberries, well, there's blueberries as in the fruit, but like blue holly berries. I just put those ones in because I thought they looked really pretty. There's all our red berries. Now let's do our little blue berries here. I'm just watering it down so it's nice and thin and not super dark or cakey. Now I'll put it down. Okay, now we're going to let our berries dry and then we'll come back and we'll use that brown that we mixed and do our stems. So I'll just set that aside. Take this one and do our kind of medium-sized tree here. I'm just going to check your comments really quick. Make sure I'm not missing anything. Let's see here. Okay, I don't think I am. I don't see any up there. Let's see. One of you is asking if you can paint with watercolors on canvas. Yes, you can. There's some super cool things that you can use for that. One is called Watercolor Ground. I think there's 2 different brands that use this. You can put this on canvas, on wood, on all kinds of other things, and you can, it essentially makes that surface kind of like watercolor paper, so you can use that. So yeah, if you wanted to do that, you could get something like this and put it on canvas or whatever and paint with watercolors on that. It's super cool. Let me see any other comments that I missed. One of you missed the start of the wreath. No worries, I'm gonna be posting this video later, so if this was fast for you or if you missed a part, you'll be able to go back and watch it a second time. Okay, yeah, I know I paint really fast. It's because I just live in a very dry climate, and so I have to paint fast, otherwise my colors will dry. And so, yeah, but the video is always available, so you can rewatch and paint at your own pace. So let's get back to this card, and we're going to do our wet and wet wash for our last tree here. So let me get a jar of plain water, and we'll just fill it all in with water. Okay. And just like this first tree and the second tree, I'm going to be doing sap green more on the left and phthalo blue more on the right. So we'll take some of our sap green here, get it all nice and wet, and drop that in. Now I'm adding some of that teal that I had mixed, and I'm going to mix a little bit more with the sap green and the phthalo blue. Bring it up here to the top. Fill this with a little more water. just adding more of the phthalo blue to the right side. And I dropped a bloom into my green right there before the green dried. Okay, now you can add a few blooms in there, wherever the water is kind of damp. Okay, and then you can set that aside to dry. And that is our Christmas tree card. Super fun. We'll come back to the wreath and pick up that brown that we had mixed earlier. We were using the quinacridone red and the sap green, a tiny bit of the phthalo blue. You honestly don't even need much of the phthalo blue or any at all. The red and the green will make a pretty nice brown. Okay, and now we'll just add our little stems here. And over to this side. And you can go ahead and take your kneaded eraser or your plastic eraser and get rid of any of those pencil designs. You can put your signature on your cards as well if you like. Or again, you can write something in the middle of this, like hope, or joy, or peace, or jolly, any of those fun Christmas words or festive words. I really like using these kneaded erasers because they're just pretty gentle and they just pick up the graphite without messing with the fibers of the paper. So we have this card and we have our Christmas tree card. And like I said earlier, if you want to make a variation like this one with your wreath or words or anything, have at it. Have fun with your card designs and have fun sharing with them with your friends. If you were painting along, I would absolutely love to see what you did, and I'm going to post a little link, well, not a link, just a little post in the discussion section so you can comment and add your photos in there. I'm going to turn this camera around just so I can say goodbye and Merry Christmas and all that stuff. So yeah, there we go. Anyways, thank you again so much for joining. That was really fun. I always am happy to be able to do these. I'll be doing probably another one sometime in the new year. December is a really busy month for me, so I don't think I'll get to it next month, but in the new year. And yeah, thank you again for joining, and I look forward to next time. Merry Christmas.